join us a bit later. First, we are going to briefly introduce a study that will be published right after this event that we prepared with my colleagues at Political Capital Institute. I would name two of them, Patrik Szicherle and Csaba Molnár, who elaborated the methodology and wrote most of the studies. So we are briefly introducing it. You will be able to read it right after the event. Then we will have a nice discussion with our members of the European Parliament. And then at the end of the event, Christopher Walker, the Vice President of the National Endowment for Democracy, for whom we are grateful for being here and also for supporting the project. He will comment on what has been said at the roundtable and add the transatlantic perspective plus a global perspective to the discussion. I would just like to remind you that you can raise questions during the panel. You can raise them here, and we, the speakers, will see that, and I, the moderator, will be able to target them to the speakers. If you are following us on Facebook, please raise questions there at the comment, and if we will have time, then we are happy to respond them. If not, then we will respond on the Facebook side. So. That's about the brief introduction. And also I would like to mention that we had very good, originally we would have Radoslav Sikorski from the European People's Party at the panel as well from Poland, but unfortunately he informed us that he can't join because there's no Wi-Fi connection at the hotel there he stays currently. So unfortunately we won't have him in the panel. One last thing before I begin with the content, we did this study and the whole project in cooperation not only with the National Endowment for Democracy, but also with professional think tank partners from the region, Center for Democratic Integrity in Austria, Visegrad Insight in Poland, European Values in Czech Republic, Institute for Public Affairs in Slovakia, Global Focus in Romania, and Center for Study of Democracy in Bulgaria. Why did we do a study on the influence, authoritarian influence in the European Parliament? We just received a question from someone probably who registered, and the question is, why does it matter if relatively powerless MEPs are influenced by authoritarian governments? I mean, my response would be that why does it matter? First, it matters because the European Parliament matters more and more. And I think it's rather a positive development. I think the European Parliament could be an even important player in the European setting, which would make the foreign policy of the European Union more value-based and more democratic at the same time. But still, we already can see that the European that the MEPs and the European Parliament can put a pressure on other institutions, can think in package logic and force out support for some kind of measures. And we can already see success on some field. For example, I think stepping up against foreign disinformation, foreign interference, some of the institutional approaches to that, the initiatives all came from the European Parliament. We concluded in our study that the European Parliament is somehow the conscience of the European Union. And we know that conscience, unfortunately, not always drives our behavior, but it does in many times. And when it doesn't, it creates guilt. And guilt on the long run, I think, finally influences behavior as well. So what we did during the study is that we prepared, I don't want to go deeply into methodological details, but we prepared two indexes. We prepared the counter-authoritarian index and the Kremlin critical index, both based on resolutions in the European Parliament. And what we were curious for is that how groups in the European Parliament, how particular members of the European Parliament, especially in the Central Eastern European countries I mentioned, were voting on these resolutions. We prepared the counter-authoritarian index based on 19 resolutions, votes on 19 resolutions in a diverse set of votes, including, for example, the rights of the Chinese in Uyghurs, to the, let's say, criticizing the foreign the policies of the Kremlin, for example, undermining the legitimacy of the NGOs or the Foreign Agents Act, and so on. So it's the Kremlin critical index were composed of 7 votes. The counter-authoritarian index were composed of 19 votes. And what we found is, first of all, that there is a very general support for the for stepping up against authoritarian influence within the European Union, especially among the mainstream parties. So in most of the votes, what we found is, and I think here the European mainstream is broader than we usually talk about. So the more mainstream political forces, not that only the European People's Party and the Socialists and Democrats and Renew, but also Greens, and in a lot of cases ECR, are much more supportive towards, for example, stepping up against malign foreign influence coming from Kremlin, coming from China, or, for example, defending the rights of citizens in third countries, while we can see a clear difference to the parties on the radical left and the radical right. What we could see is that the radical right, Identity and Democracy, the radical left, GUE, NGL, plus the non-independents, this is 20% of the votes in the MEP, they were much less supportive towards resolutions that would extend the powers of European Union in stepping up against authoritarian influence, that would be about projecting the EU soft power in third countries, and it would be about strengthening the institutional capacities of the European Union to push back malign foreign interference. So we found that the EP is the conscience of the European Union. We also found that there are more support on the fringes than on the mainstream. We also found that there are countries, and it's a surprising list of countries, where MEPs with much higher likelihood are more supportive towards, let's say, authoritarian regimes and more reluctant to step up against them. And this is a club of 7 countries that is very diverse. We found that in Western and Southern member states, we found that Germany, France, United Kingdom, Ireland, Greece, Italy, and Cyprus have MEP delegations, members of the European Parliament, who are less likely to support Kremlin critical resolutions, authoritarian critical resolutions. And of course, why? Because in these countries we have higher delegations, more MEPs in the fringe groups, either on the radical left or the radical right. We also found that while fringes are the most important, let's say, allies of authoritarian regimes, there are numerous national parties that are supportive to authoritarians, that are either members of ruling coalitions, such as Podemos, for example, in Spain, or supporting ruling coalitions externally, such as the Portuguese Communist Party or the Communist Party of Bohemia and Moravia. So it's in the fringe, but not that much on the fringe in some member states. And the last point I would like to raise, and we have very good policy recommendations as well, but you have to read them in the study. So the last point I would like to raise is that Central Eastern European region seems to be more resilient, at least on the level of the members of the European Parliament. So it means that the MEPs from Romania, from Slovakia, even from Hungary, are less supportive, for example, or less supportive for the Kremlin, for authoritarian regimes, and they are more in favor of Kremlin critical statements. Of course, we can say that there are member states where delegations vote with the mainstream and then behave otherwise on governmental parties, such as in Hungary, but still it matters. I think it reveals that the European institutional system and the European Parliament in particular creates a normative environment that puts a pressure on the MEPs. And I think it's already something pretty important. Of course, conformity matters more. In new member states, MEPs feel that they still have to behave well, less in France, less in Germany, and so on. And also in Central Eastern European countries, we find more MEPs in the mainstream groups. So it matters, but it also underlines, again, my previous point that the European Parliament should play a more important role in foreign policy. At that point, I would like to briefly pass over the floor to my colleague, Patrik Szicherle, who will very briefly show you the website that we have just released with the MEP profiles and the votes, and then we would start the roundtable with our esteemed MEPs. So, Patrik, the floor is yours.
Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming to the event. Due to technical reasons, I do not have a camera, but I can share my screen. So let me introduce you to the website that we created for this project. This site contains, first of all, data on how MEPs voted on the 19 EP decisions that we selected for the study, especially from the V4 Austria, Bulgaria, and Romania. And we also have short MEP profiles in here, which should help the readers look behind the numbers, because the numbers never really tell the whole story, obviously. So as Péter already talked about the methodology, what I want to add is that the index scores are values between 0 and 100, where 0 marks the most sort of supportive attitude towards authoritarian practices, and 100 marks the most critical ones. Now, naturally, this is a simplification. There are various reasons why someone would vote what we consider supportively, ideological, technical, and other reasons as well. But we had to think about what, according to our assessment, might be in line with the interests of repressive regimes. So currently on our site, you can first of all see a description of the 19 decisions that we selected. And then you can see infographics, first on the results of votes by EP groups and by countries. And as you can see, as Péter said already, there's green across the board, basically, which means that most MEPs are really rather supportive of countering authoritarian influence. And then there's a second set of infograms, which is a breakdown by national parties of the V4 Austria, Bulgaria, and Romania. And we also have these short profiles. So first, let me introduce you to one from the Austrian People's Party, Othmar Karas. You can see that his score is a perfect 100. He voted every 19 times, and he voted critically every 19 times. Here you can see his short profile, which should help you look behind the numbers. And then there's another breakdown of votes and a list of how he voted individually in every single case. This is a bit more helpful with MEPs who have a bit more diverse voting patterns. So let me introduce you to another MEP, Katrina Kunitzner, who is slightly more supportive of authoritarians. Her profile should explain the reasons behind that and her thinking in detail. And as you can see, 13 times she voted supportively of authoritarian practices, and 6 times she abstained. And in this list, you can see when she abstained and when she voted against a given resolution or for a given resolution. And this website will continue to be updated, especially the profiles, and we would add more publications concerning this project to it. And well, this is basically what I had to say, and thank you for listening.
Thanks a lot, Patrik. Yeah, just one last sentence from my side. We think that even if the European Parliament is not the most important driver of the foreign policy of the European Union, unfortunately, but this index is a very important indicator of vulnerability of specific parties, specific groups, even specific MEPs. And yeah, we calculated figures for 783 MEPs because it was the pre-Brexit period as well, and the ones that came after Brexit, and it's only the last. These are only the votes of the current terms, so from 2019. But you can read the study and then see the graphs and individual MEP profiles, even from the speakers in this panel after the discussion. So. With this sentence, I would turn to the MEPs, and I would first raise a general question, and this I would turn to Viola von Kramon. Viola, you were quite vocal about Russian human rights abuses and problems with interference into the European digital and information sphere by Russia, China, even by other authoritarian countries. And there was also a letter that you and several other MEPs, including the present ones, undersigned that raised this letter issue at the European to the President of the European Commission and the European Council. So my first question would be that how would you assess the role of the European Union in general and the European Parliament in particular in shaping foreign policies? What we found is that the EU is less vulnerable to malign authoritarian influence than member states, but how would you, as an insider, assess the role of the EU and European Parliament?
Thank you, Peter. First of all, for having me here on the panel. It's a big honor, and I can only congratulate you and your colleagues to this extraordinary study you have elaborated. I think this is a lot of work, and if I had known I'm under scrutiny on this criteria, maybe I would have changed in 1 or 2 resolutions my position, but I wasn't aware of this. But nevertheless, that's great, and I think that's also very interesting, the conclusion you have mainly drawn, that there is a positive correlation between people coming from, let's say, Eastern and Central European countries having a different awareness when it comes to authoritarian malign influence than, let's say, people from the more Western or Southern states. And I could imagine we should talk a bit about the reasons for this. But asking me what would be my opinion or assessment on what should be a stronger role, or how can a stronger role of the European Union be, I can easily agree with your conclusion in one of your recommendations that the AFET, our Committee on Foreign Affairs, should have a louder saying, should be a louder voice, should have more influence when it comes to some of the questions you have raised in the beginning of your study. And I think it was like, I wasn't then at that time a member of the European Parliament, but with the beginning of Maidan, with starting the war of the Russians, especially in the Donbass region, I think there was an awakening which actually started with civil society in Ukraine, and with some smaller, let's say, fact-based or fact-checking journalists or think tankers such as you and many others, who really have shown to the world, hey, people, please be aware, look very carefully what you're doing and what are the narratives of especially the Kremlin towards the European Union. And I know, especially in Germany, it was very, very hard to get these messages through, because people were very easy in saying, hey, yeah, we have to find a balanced position. We have to look at both sides while not understanding that one side is not neutral. One side is absolutely interest-driven by a very destructive character. And I think this message went through, especially while many people from Central and Eastern European countries were working on this issue for the last years. And so I would see your study as one of these puzzle pieces, understanding and making the public understand what's going on in some of the countries such as Russia or maybe also China and others. I understand that you have quoted, for example, Sergei Lavrov at the beginning of your study, that he's not happy with this multiple character or style or institutionalized character of the European Union, and that's true. But I could imagine that it is much easier to tackle the European External Action Service, especially some of the delegations on the ground. I have no idea how the delegation, for example, in Moscow does work. But for us in the European Parliament, it's absolutely true what you have observed and what you have discovered, that there is a very broad majority against any kind of influence. And even in some of the resolutions you have quoted and you have mentioned, I feel a little bit, let's say, unfair being addressed as one of the sympathizer of an authoritarian regime, while of course you haven't followed our inside group discussions before. When it comes to the Magnitsky list, for example, we are very, very much committed for any kind of Magnitsky Act list, but we don't want to call it Magnitsky Act because Mr. Bill Browder was lobbying in a way which wasn't, let's say, the most decent way of lobbying. So it was more a personal way of not joining the majority in that case than it was a content question or it was a topical question. Of course, we are for a very harsh human rights sanction list, and also with a reference to Magnitsky. We were just always against this Magnitsky, called Magnitsky Act. And there was, let's say, a little minor issue. And now we are on that very, let's say, on that topic in a wrong basket, I would call it. And also you could go through some of the other resolutions. But in general, I think it's very helpful. And also you could align the, let's say, minority between the very right wings being influenced, heavy influenced in all of the countries. Especially when you look at Austria, we have a broad majority from FPÖ, but also from other parties being influenced for a long time by Russian oligarchs buying real estate in Vienna and so on and so forth, but also, of course, investing into security, intelligence service people. Now you have probably followed the Masalek case. I mean, this is a very dirty business and Austria is right in the middle of it. And so when you call the Central and Eastern European state, I would really exclude Austria, because apart from some Greens and Claudia Gamon from the NGO-s, the majority is very much in favor of a pro-Russian view. Maybe not a hardcore, but FPÖ and many of the other SPÖs. So we could go into more details in this, but in general, I would very much strengthen and endorse your question or your proposal to give the effort a stronger voice in all these foreign policy questions than we have now.
Yeah, thank you very much. And yeah, just a brief response to some of the points you raised. Yes, regarding Austria, I think, yes, the figures are a bit surprising, but I think it also reveals that yeah, the members of the European Parliament are not always behaving the same way as they do at home. I mean, from the representatives of respective countries, domestic politics is in a lot of times different than European politics, and usually in the European Parliament they behave better, which is the case in Austria as well, where I think you're totally right that I mean this kind of let's say approach towards the Kremlin that is about relativizing some kind of human rights problems and interference in the European Union. It's pretty much part of the mainstream. I think we see a similar pattern in Hungary, where, for example, the MEPs of Fidesz seem to be one of the most hawkish in the European People's Party's groups, almost. But at the same time, in some cases not, but in most times do. Of course, they do not tell us too much about how Budapest shapes its foreign policy. Still, when Fidesz delegates are in the European Union and the European Parliament, they know they have to behave differently, and I think it's still important. And regarding the Magnitsky Act, yes, I think you're right that there can be many interpretations to that. We thought that this is an important vote, and we decided just to go for this binary logic, either or against, which, of course, I mean, there will be, I mean, if any of you will see the list, I think you will criticize some points, but at the same time, if you take a look at the index, I think it is rather by face value seems to show and support expectations. So I would turn to Anna Donát now. Anna, you will be a member of a special committee that will deal with the very issues that we are talking about. So foreign interference into electoral processes, foreign interference into the information environment of the European Union, threats of the member states, threats to the member states by foreign countries. So what would be your expectations by this committee, and also what do you think are the main challenges that the EU and the member states are facing at the moment? I know this is bit too much questions. Feel free to just respond some of them.
Thank you, Péter. Thank you for inviting me. I wish I could answer you briefly and sharp in one sentence to these questions, because it means that we know, if we know the answers, then we can resolve the issues. You mentioned there's a new special committee gonna stood up shortly in the European Parliament, which also shows that these issues has high importance nowadays. And I'm really happy that this new Parliament realized that there's a need for a subcommittee, a new committee. As all of us knows that foreign interference, disinformation concerns many different policy areas, both internal and external level. My group, Renew Europe, also published an opinion paper on this issue, and I remember that when we were discussing the details, our members on the AFET committee and our members on the LIBE committee argued the most. And I think such a subcommittee's first role and aim is to bring all these policy areas together, but not just within the European Parliament, but also bring other actors together. And why I'm so happy to be a part of that subcommittee is because, of course, as I mentioned, the role or the connection of the LIBE committee. I'm a member of the LIBE committee. For me, democracy, rule of law issues are one of the most important political issues. I think it's really understandable coming from Hungary, and I think most of our guests who are listening to these talks knows a lot what's happening in Hungary. But I wanted to really highlight that why is it so important from this regard, because disinformation campaigns aims to weaken and divide our societies, because it erodes trust and distort public perceptions of key issues and harms democracy and rule of law by affecting key principles and values such as freedom of speech, freedom of expression, right to information, media pluralism. I was just mentioning this, that it's way much more than what we imagine about foreign interface. I think there's a lot of human rights and democracy issues, rule of law issues involved, which wouldn't be enough to discuss within the LIBE committee. I really want to see an EU who is focusing issues from looking at the bigger picture, to combine all the elements and try to find answers. So therefore, this committee going to bring MEPs from different policy horizons to ensure coherence. And I really expect from this committee to be brave and political, because especially because there's not just politicians, MEPs going to be involved. Our job is going to be a little bit more, because I believe that in many cases, and I think this is what also can find in your research paper, why there's kind of like the European Parliament is stronger against foreign interference than national parliaments, for instance, so national governments, is because the political moves within the parliament and the focus and the interest lays differently. And I believe that we have to use this power, and we have to bring brave political statements within the game, because nowadays all these issues are mostly influenced, decided in the council, where it's anonymity. And of course, who is sitting in the council? Leaders of member states, who's bringing their national interest to the table. Meanwhile, a member of the European Parliament not necessarily doing their job based on national interest. They also belong to different groups within the parliament, and they do politics based on different values and mentalities. Therefore, I believe that this committee has a really important role. Of course, we don't know too much details about its relation to other committees and how much power it gets at the end. But I believe that it can be a game changer relating in these issues. I don't know if I answered to your questions. I think we're going to go more deeper in the subtopics later on.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think it's very important that you highlighted the interconnectedness of the foreign challenges and the internal challenges, which is the problem were only that foreign authoritarian countries want to interfere into the old democratic environment of EU member states. Unfortunately, it's not always the case. And I think it's important to put the two in the same framework, so national governments can use the sharp power of Russia and China, for example, to press their own national interests as well and keep on government. And I think it's also very important that you mentioned the anonymity of the European Council. One of the proposals of our study, which is of course not something very new, but still very actual, that foreign policy decisions should be made more on a qualified majority voting than on the principle of anonymity. Otherwise, the EU will never be able to become a serious foreign policy player. I would turn to Michal Šimečka now. Michal, I would raise the general question to you as well. What do you think about the role of the European Parliament and EU as a foreign policy actor towards these challenges? And I would target one question to you from the ex-leader of the Socialists and Democrats group, Hans Swoboda, who raised the question that how today's MEPs think they can transfer their ethical, moral position into effective policy. So it's a quite general question, but how do you try to fill the gap between the expectations and the moral higher ground and the practical difficulties of implementing good policies?
Thank you, Péter, and also from my side, it's I'm very honored to be here, and congratulations on the paper. I've read the draft before joining the discussion, and it really is rich and a lot of stuff in there. I also after this is finished, I have to check what my profile is and how do I score. But on the general question which you asked, and also the report kind of deals with that about how the different EU institutions or the EU as a whole is vulnerable to authoritarian influence. And I have to say, I really like the point that you make, is that compared to nation states or compared to to member states, the EU as an institutional matrix is paradoxically perhaps even much more difficult to manipulate from the outside because it's sort of, so to speak, all over the place. So and this I have to say I very much agree with. And while the EU institutions and the EU kind of foreign policy, but also general policy making, is probably more entry points for authoritarian influence, and it's probably more vulnerable because there are so many institutions, so many actors, and so it's easier to somehow get access, but it's much harder to influence and shape outcomes when you're, say, an authoritarian regime or its intelligence service, and you want to kind of bend a process to your will in the European Union. It is extremely difficult because the process is so diffused, and it's not clear who is actually making the decisions, or where the power actually lies, because it's dispersed. And I think in a way this is good about the European Union. So because you obviously have the Commission, the Parliament, and the Council, and at the nexus of power somewhere at the intersection. But seeing it from Russia or from anywhere else, you would have to capture a lot of these points to be able to actually manipulate the process. Now, and I see, for instance, that the Chinese seem to have invested some time in penetrating the EAS, which I have to say, well, I mean, obviously we should guard against it, but at the end of the day, EES is not where the power lies in the European Union. Definitely not when it comes to making foreign policy decisions. But this is just as a side note, and this is, I very much agree with your assessment on the role of the European Parliament. I also agree that it could be cited, the conscience of European foreign policy. I would highlight the human rights urgency resolutions that the Parliament is voting basically every month, every Strasbourg. This is a very unique instrument, which some people have may not even heard of, but it actually has real influence on the cases themselves. So it's often targeting authoritarian practices or defending people who are in prison because of their political beliefs, or defending dissidents in various countries. And we have 3 of those every month, and they actually matter to the concrete people or to the government. And this is a very unique thing. I don't know any parliament which does it on this scale. So I would also highlight this. And obviously, the Parliament as a whole has long-standing preferences for a strong and normative EU foreign policy, and then that's part of that, including Magnitsky sanctions, but also about all sorts of other issues. The problem, obviously, is that foreign policy being intergovernmental, even after the Lisbon Treaty, there's very little influence of the Parliament. It's different somewhat for neighborhood and enlargement policy, where the European Parliament actually has a say, especially on pieces of legislation that have to do with financing, say, instrument for pre-accession assistance or the European Neighborhood Instrument. This is where MEPs really shape the legislation, and therefore, even for an authoritarian country like Russia, it actually might be worthwhile trying to manipulate that and through the MEPs, because that's where real money is handed out, and it can influence, especially in the Western Balkans. The European Parliament carries some influence, and this is also partly to the an answer to the question by Nehane Svoboda. I think the Parliament, especially the Foreign Affairs Committee, the best chance of translating the members' sort of views into outcomes is on neighborhood and on enlargement, because this is where the Commission is their counterpart, and they should make the Commission accountable. Finally, I wanted to talk about Slovakia, because when I said that it's difficult to manipulate political outcomes in the EU as a whole, it's much easier in member states. You said that. I would like to talk about Slovakia because it's an interesting case, but I don't know if I have the time. If I have 1 more minute, because there's a very interesting case study of 2 different political parties in Slovakia, and one of them is actually now a member of in the European Parliament, and there are 2 MEPs from Slovakia who are on the far extreme right, and you mentioned them quite a lot in the paper. They're for the fascist part. They were elected for the fascists, so they're non-attached, but I mean very pro-Russian. I think they score the worst in your matrix. But the fun part is that obviously their views are very much pro-Russian and pro-authoritarian, but the Russian government doesn't want to have anything to do with them because they're too extreme. So even the Russian Foreign Ministry a couple of years back, actually, when they had this report on the state of human rights, whatever, in the European Union, they've singled out this party for having extremist views in Slovakia. So actually, there isn't really, there is not being used by Russia because they're, even in the Slovak political context, they are left, they will never have a real influence because they're ostracized, they're fascists. So I think it doesn't even make sense for the Russians to invest in them as it does in other foreign far-right parties. On the other hand, you had a party called the Slovak National Party, which was in government the previous mandate, which had the chairman of the National Council and captured the Ministry of Defense and the Secret Service, and there were clear links to Russia because it mattered, because it was a party which was not marginal, which actually influenced government policy, such as Slovakia not showing solidarity with Britain in the Skripal case, all of these things, and there where you really see the authoritarian influence. But the party has to have some shot of being relevant in the national context. Sorry, I spoke for too long.
Thank you. I think it's a very important point to raise. What we analyzed quite a lot the Russian influence in the Central Eastern European far right and extreme right, and what we found is that sometimes this contradiction that you mentioned can be well treated in Russian foreign policy meaning many layers, including the secret services, GRU, and so on and so on. But on the one hand, we could see, for example, with the Hungarian Jobbik party, when it was a hardcore far-right party with strongly anti-Semitic and anti-Roma views, that on the one hand, they established some ties with Russian Federation and even diplomats from the Russian Federation. On the other hand, sometimes the Russian media were reporting about the horrible far right in the European Union, that look who are the fascists and racists in the European Union. They pointed their finger on their allies, Jobbik. So I think Russian foreign policy sometimes can tolerate this kind of ambivalence, but you're right that the most important players are on the mainstream. I mean, you should be on the mainstream to really influence decisions, and that's why analyzing mainstream forces who are having some kind of power on national level is more important. I would like to welcome Mikuláš Peksa, the discussion from the Private Party from Czech Republic and from the Greens group. Mikuláš, I would bring you in the discussion if you don't mind immediately. My general question in the first round to the panel was that how important you think that the European Parliament and the European Union is in foreign policy, and one optimistic finding of our study was that the EU in general and the European Parliament in particular is probably less vulnerable to the malign foreign influence from Russia, from China, from authoritarian states than nation states. Usually, authoritarian for the European Union and its setting is very hard to understand from an authoritarian logic. Where is the person to approach? Who is the boss? Who to call if I want to arrange something? So how do you see that?
First of all, I hope you can hear me.
Perfectly.
Perfect. And thanks very much for the invitation. I'm deeply sorry for coming late, but it was a little bit overlapping with our committee on the budgetary affairs. That's one that's maybe not that much known, but for some reason, for those, let's say, authoritarians within the EU, it's a little bit less popular than you could expect. Speaking about the external influences, I think this is not really easy because, as you have described, the EU is a mechanism of a lot of stakeholders, a lot of various bodies, and of course, who looking on it from the outside has to try to understand how to influence it, how to use it for his or her purpose. And of course, I think this is sort of the analysis both Russia and China are doing, and both of them are trying to find some weaknesses they could influence. What I do believe is that somehow, as the EU as such is kind of built up on the philosophy, we built all our democratic systems it is sort of like quite like resistant. Of course, you can still have some people who will be like supportive to Russia, having leaning to Russia, spreading the narratives that Russia is willing to spread. However, the whole structure as it is built on robust ideas of individual freedoms, individual rule of law, and human dignity. And when you think about it, it is quite like hard to somehow challenge it from the authoritarian positions. Because if you try to challenge it from the authoritarian positions and you seek for a dictator you could find within the EU in order to have an agreement and do some sort of like classical, let's say, dictator stuff, there is no one in within. There are just those influences, and this can be much more distributed. I think you have mentioned previously here some Hungary or Slovakia. I could definitely some cases from Czechia where you see this a confirmation of this overall pattern that repeats and repeats, and that's the far-right parties are being quite close towards Russia. That's something which is, I believe, kind of like observed everywhere in Europe. At least, like we have seen that from France, we have seen it from Hungary. I think at that point the strategy is quite like similar, and kind of like encrypted or decrypted or debunked, because like we know that it happens, and of the day within the European Parliament, or at least within the European Parliament, there works something like which is called a cordon sanitaire, which is effectively a policy that most of the major groups, they do not cooperate with the far right, most of them. So I think this is not really the biggest issue we currently have, because this is the danger we know about. Which is, what is maybe more, let's say, dangerous is are the influences of China, because they are not so, let's say, party focused. They are not focused so much on the far right, but are distributed among the parties which you would usually consider to be democratic. Rather, we have seen some cases of Czech social democrats being quite like leaning towards policies of Chinese Communist Party, while in the other areas I would not really blame them to be too different from what's common for the social democrats. And why this is why I think it is quite like common to set up stronger ties. I think we have seen, which is kind of like surprising, some interesting ties even for let's say a conservative party, like one of my colleagues here in the parliament, who is from the Czech ECR group. He had quite like strong ties to China, promoting trade with China, and well, that could be a lot more complicated. The difference, I believe, is kind of like in the both powers, because if you look into Russia, they do not really supply high tech devices that we would rely on. While we have ongoing discussion currently in Europe about 5G and other technologies that are being produced in China. China is quite like successful in providing them. However, you can hardly have a trust that those devices we are supplied by China do not do respect all the standards we have for personal data, privacy, and so on. So and there were cases where it was more complicated. So speaking about the authoritarian influences, I would now be more focused on, let's say, the distributed network of let's say Chinese friends within various parties who are promoting this let's say trade with, because at the end of the day, this data security is what is kind of like base for a digital sovereignty of Europe in future. Yep. So I think that that's from my side for the invitation. I will gladly participate in the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much. We will return to the national influences a bit more if we will have time. But at the same time, we had very good questions, and we have, I would say, quite an audience to this discussion. After Hans Svoboda, we have a question from Vuk Jeremic, who was Foreign Minister of Serbia, and also right now active in Serbian politics. His question, I would not phrase it otherwise. I will just read his question and feel free to respond. It's about Serbia. Michal already mentioned that in the neighborhood policy, European Union has probably a stronger role than in foreign policy in general. This is pretty critical question. Let me raise it to you and feel free to pick it up. Are you aware of the dismal state of affairs when it comes to democracy and media freedom, in particular in Serbia? Following the recent elections boycotted by all mainstream opposition parties, the ruling coalition of the leading Balkan autocrat, Alexander Vučić, controls 235 out of 250 seats in the National Assembly. Several groups in the European Parliament have on numerous occasions criticized the situation in the country. However, the largest groups, EPP, never joined any of those initiatives. Wish Radoslav Sikorski were with us to respond that, but I see that Viola is raising a blue card. So
yes, I would quickly like to respond. I've seen the question before, and it really tempted. I was really tempted to immediately reply to this. I mean, I completely agree with Mr. Jeremic, because that is the biggest failure of the EPP for this period. I would say not joining our statements, our open criticism, and really, I mean, you have seen Tusk, you have seen the other EPP leaders. We have some other, I don't want to name them now, in the EPP who endorse Vučić, and also, unfortunately, the German government, also our chancellor, still backs that very autocratic leader. I have no idea why, to be honest, because Vučić obviously violates all democratic norms and values in the European Union, and it is a big shame to see that the EPP is not stepping back and turning its back towards him, and at least try to moderate the situation in Serbia a bit. We have seen before the Corona crisis, we have seen it during and after the Corona crisis. I mean, the civil society, independent media, everything is really under pressure. And we have sent a solidarity letter, and I have sent a little message to the only independent mayor in Szabadka, where they have to repeat elections on Saturday. They have bought the votes in the local election at the beginning of, or the end of July. I mean, they have taken all the instruments from falsification of votes. There were no independent observation missions allowed. There were nobody on the ground. I had some contacts to the OSCE ODIHR core team, and they were just speechless about what happened in Serbia. And after all, we got a briefing by our head of the delegation, the EU delegation in Serbia, in Belgrade, and there was a big mess. I mean, he simply endorsed and supported and agreed with what was Vučić doing. And that's, of course, terrible, disappointing. And I could imagine the progressive forces in the country, people will leave because they don't see any real European perspective in Serbia for the next years. And that is the responsibility of EPP as well, I would say.
Thank you, Vila. Anyone else on Serbia? Okay, if not, then I would raise another question from Kata Moravec. She asks the panelists, MEPs do in a sense tend to have national but mostly party interests, as they often tend to go back to national politics once their term is over. Do you think they tend to be bolder or have contradictory positions to their party's national standpoint? Does the media coverage of EP or the lack of it matter? Similarly, can their need to conform, as new member states are still often underrepresented in committee positions of power, matter more than ideology? So quite a lot of questions, but it brings us back to one of the points we raised, that we see that in the European Parliament, usually some parties are behaving in a totally different manner when it comes to foreign policy, when as in their national parties and the national context, and also how much you think that the European Parliament shapes, if anyhow, domestic political discussions about issues in the respective countries. So the connection between European Parliament and national politics. Does anyone would like to respond that? Michal, the floor is yours.
Yeah, well, thanks for the question. I think it is, to a certain extent, it's true that you have politicians who actually, when they're elected to the European Parliament, this is also a well-known, political science theory, they socialize into the normative and political attitudes and views of their peers. So, for instance, in the previous mandates, there were members of the European Parliament from the Socialists in Slovakia, that was Smer, dominant party, and they were way more progressive, the MEPs, than the party was, and way more pro-European and even tougher on authoritarian regimes than the actual party back home, because simply they spent the time in the institution, and that in a way changed them. For myself, I have to say that I'm one of the lucky ones, but probably I think there are most of us in the Renew group that my party in progressive Slovakia back home is that we're completely in sync in all of the positions that I take in the European Parliament. So in that sense, we're a liberal progressive party as in the European Parliament as well as back home. The second question that was there, and this is Slovakia, is again sort of a paradigmatic case study and a negative one, is that there is a disconnect between what's happening in the European Parliament and the national political arena. I think there's very little crossover, very little issues when they're raised in the European Parliament or debated in the European Parliament, they get picked up in the Slovak media or by Slovak politicians. Even when MEPs from Slovakia are in the media, in the national media, or discussing issues, they're always discussing it just among each other. So whenever there's a foreign policy debate or EU policy debate, there are three MEPs on discussing with each other rather than discussing with national MPs or ministers of the government. So in that way, I think that the problem, at least in Slovakia, which has the lowest turnout in EP elections, and might be one of the reasons, the work in the European Parliament is seen as completely distant and separate from what's happening in national politics every day, and that's a shame.
Thank you. Anna?
Sorry, I needed to unmute myself. I want to just add a little bit to what Michal also started coming from Hungary. Previously, I mean, before I became an MEP, my experience was that we have no idea what's happening in the European Parliament. I remember the very first plenaries when some colleagues of mine said that, okay, I know already how the media are going to write about it, and I was asking about what. So this is why it's super important what, for instance, Political Capital is doing with this new webpage that we can monitor MEPs' votes. This is something unknown in Hungary. Since the beginning, I'm an MEP. I'm trying to bring the voice of Europe to Hungary. Why? Because and this is the answer why Fidesz MEPs voting completely differently how the Hungarian government refers in foreign interface or its relation to authoritarian regimes, is because so far they could play this double face act. The role of Fidesz MEPs in the European Parliament is to show that actually there's nothing wrong with this party, to sell a completely different pedigree of our governmental party, what they actually doing back home, because who cares what's happening in the periphery of the European Union. Of course, it's changed a lot since the Article 7 procedure, and now that all the discussion about rule of law issue Hungary is in focus now. But all these tools help. So right now, I think everything is changing, but also changing from the other side, because of course we haven't talked, this really not, is just connecting this issue, what we are talking about, because we talked a little bit about disinformation. I wanted to raise that there's again a super interesting issue, what's happening when this disinformation comes from the state level, comes from the government itself, and it's not the government we expect to fight against, because this is what's happening in Hungary. And they build up a propaganda machine, like 80% of the media is covered by government close oligarchs, or even, you know, with the government itself, which also says that whatever I'm doing in the European Parliament, they have a narrative to tell about it. So now the propaganda started to use such a tool to make a double face, selling completely differently how we are voting, how we are acting, what we are saying in the European Parliament, and using it against us in Hungary. But of course, just taking one little comments or one vote from 350 votes within a file, and then this is why they put it in the media. So I just wanted to add, like, this is why it's a very much more complex issue, national politics and European politics, and the role of media within. I think all what we can experience nowadays, I want to highlight the importance of civil society and its watchdog role, and also the responsibility of the citizens, because MEPs are the only one directly elected at a European level. So I really want to highlight everywhere the citizens need to want to know what we are doing, showing the mirror, and asking for such a tool that also Political Capital just announced now, because many MEPs hiding behind behind their votes, you know, because all the statistics about how the groups voting, and at the end who win in such a, like in an ideological debate about a resolution or a file, but there's not that many words on single acts. And what I am saying in Hungary is parallel how I'm behaving through vote in a European Parliament. So this is the only thing I wanted to add at the top of this.
Thank you. It's really an important point to raise, and I'm also grateful because you already responded one of the questions raised in the audience by Gürkan Özturan, who just asked about the far-right authoritarian parties, what kind of media dominance they have in the respective countries. I think what you described about Fidesz in Hungary, which is unfortunately by every standard qualifies as a far-right party already. I think it's pretty important. I mean, this kind of media influence can just come from the fringes, but unfortunately from the mainstream as well. Mikuláš raised his hand, and I would like to target you a question, because I think it was your input and it's a response to that note regarding digital sovereignty that was mentioned a moment ago. This has been used by the Turkish government to promote the latest censorship law, which is designed to silence the remaining digital media in the country, decorated with invasive content removal powers. Do MEPs think any protective measures they pass in the EP set a bad example for some authoritarian governments outside of the EU? Very important question. Mikuláš, feel free to respond it if you want, or feel free to raise the point that you originally wanted.
Well, actually, this is quite interconnected because what the EP does, and it's quite often like mentioned in a good way, can be quite like this misinterpreted by the authoritarian governments, either in EP or in the EU or elsewhere. I remember some example which maybe my Hungarian colleagues will know even better, because I know that when the COVID anti-COVID measures were introduced in Hungary, I think Hungarian government used like a term of fake news spreading in order to introduce censorship within the Hungary. So at the end of the day, the more we are trying to control spreading of the information, the more tools we are providing to the authoritarian propaganda to later on misuse it against us. I just had one more short comment regarding the discussion about the relation between national and European politics. I think it very much depends on which party you are talking about, because some of the parties, they work that way that they are effectively like layered. There is a like regional organization or municipal organization, regional organization, state level organization, and the European organization, and they do not much like work with each other. Like those on the low level of the organization just elect the level above them, and so on and so on. So this in this chain of like authority, effectively the contact with normal people is lost. And then you really see that there is a difference between what the people on the European level say and what the people on the national level say. And the discussion becomes completely divergent. I like remember one example when there was like a Czech ANO party, that's the ruling one, reacting to the resolution regarding Hungary. I remember the MEPs, they were voting in favor of the resolution condemning the attacks against rule of law in Hungary, while in the Czech parliament, their colleagues from they distanced and even condemned position of own party, which is completely like weird, but that actually happened. So it is being misused by the propaganda, and it very much depends on the strength of the communication channel between Europe and the national states. I don't know how is it in Hungary or other countries. I know in Czechia it works effectively that way, that there are 4 permanent journalists placed in Brussels. So that means there are 4 people who are completely fully responsible to do media coverage of whatever happens in the EU for the whole country. I know them, I trust them very much, but I think this is not the way how the communication shall work. We should be much more aware of what's going on here in the Brussels, and should be communicated to the citizens. They should have a clear and honest discussion on that, and it should be more transparent. Sorry for like taking too much place.
I think it's a crucially important point. One of the recommendations that we raised in the study is that also, I mean, media and also the European Union from its media funds should invest more on let's say, delivering the important information that is happening in Brussels. And it's not, I mean, it's not delivered because it's always very boring, as many say. It's not delivered because in a lot of time there are not enough resources to write about that. And correspondence would definitely help, and media, let's say, sponsorships or let's say support that can help this coverage. And for example, in Hungary, what happened is that many newspapers that had their Brussels correspondents were simply, how to say, disappeared under a small governmental pressure and media ownership tricks. So finally, if you want to hear voices from the European Parliament, you can usually hear, and you can mostly hear, the governmental media, which is of course a special angle to this event. I would just like to raise a last question. Then unfortunately we have to turn to the end of the discussion. But Viola, there is a question which is related to Germany. Thanks for the interesting panel. Yesterday, German government confirmed that there is an evidence about the use of Novichok-related nerve gas used on Alexei Navalny. They announced talks to be held with EU and NATO on responding to this incident and addressing Russia. What role do you see the EP to play? And there is another question from József Orosz, which is about how big damage Putin's Russia has done on the European Union. So it's quite a general question. Please respond it to in 1 minute.
Yeah, I already try. I mean, this is a crucial question, a crucial case. I do hope that at that point we can, let's say, draw back the topic into the European Union's, let's say, observatory, because now it was always a bilateral business trade deal, as the Chancellor has called it. And now I think that many people in Germany, also many politicians, have recognized now this is actually a European topic. And I hope that we find a common a joint state point that this is up to the European Union to decide on the future of this horrible trade, because the dependency, the energy dependency, is not just a German thing, it is a European thing, and is especially affects many European and Central European countries. So I do hope that the Chancellor will ease on her former position, and we could have a stronger stand and hopefully even stop this in a way which will be understood in the Kremlin that only economical power, only economical sanction will Putin make understand that he really overstepped a red line. Otherwise, there's nothing which could stop this guy in the Kremlin. So I hope the EP could have a strong role. We have just opened one petition from Reinhard Bütikofer, a colleague, and there will be others. I guess the case will be discussed in the AFET and other committees as well. And I hope, as I said, that the EAD, the Commission President von der Leyen will take, will take up this case.
Okay, thank you. Now I would like to turn to Christopher Walker, who was listening to our conversation so far, and he would make concluding comments on what has been said so far. So, Christopher, you are the author of many studies on foreign interference of Russia, of China in a whole global context. You, with your colleagues at National Endowment for Democracy, invented the term sharp power, which I find extremely useful in conceptualizing all the threats that are coming through various channels that aim to change decisions in national and international organizations, and also to undermine the democratic process and democratic integrity. So I would like you to raise a few points about how do you see this threat from United States also on a global stage, and what do you think about these debates going on in the European Union these days from an eyes from the United States?
So first of all, Peter, I want to thank you for the invitation to join you and really commend Political Capital for this important work. It's a real privilege to be here with the MEPs, and this discussion has just been outstanding. It's been so insightful and civil. It's really been a privilege to listen to it and take part. I think one of the things I would really stress at the outset, I think the sort of work you're doing, Peter, the sort of rigorous analysis that you're bringing to bear helps audiences understand and recognize the patterns that are emerging. I think they're terribly important patterns that have emerged at least over the last decade, maybe longer, that democracies have been slow to recognize, and now we're in the midst of it. And maybe to get at this point, I'll just touch on three issues I think are worth highlighting. So the first one is, it's on this idea of the wider patterns of authoritarian influence that have taken shape globally, and I would suggest that at multiple levels. So we can't look at any single challenge, any single institution in a vacuum. And so, for example, Russia and China especially have demonstrated to us, it's pretty clear now, both the capacity and the intention to influence independent institutions in free societies, including universities, think tanks, and the media, but not limited to those. We also see the use of what some call, my colleagues at the Center for International Private Enterprise call corrosive capital, which in shorthand is effectively the use of economic investments for authoritarian non-economic ends, including for purposes of political manipulation. It's a form of strategic corruption that I think at least one of our speakers alluded to this idea that the influence coming from Moscow or Beijing or such places has a certain ambition behind it. And I'll come back to that. And I think we really need to be mindful of this. And so today we face serious issues relating to academic freedom, freedom of expression more generally, issues that are cutting to the heart of democratic health and integrity. Australia is an example of a country where there's an ongoing struggle right now as we speak to defend principles of democratic integrity in that country's politics, in its parliament, in its media, and in its academic sector. Some of the issues that were raised by the European Parliament members today are quite suggestive of some of the issues that Australian parliamentarians are wrestling with. Similarly in Canada and other democratic settings. And so I think I'd really stress this issue of a global challenge that has emerged among different countries, among different institutions, both at the institutional level, as I noted, universities, the media sector, the tech sector was raised earlier. I think all of these are worthy of discussion, but this is also happening at the country and national level in places as diverse as Europe, North America, Africa, and Latin America. And I think it's worth noting that this is an authentic global challenge. One other observation I would make, and I think it's important for the representatives who are with us in this discussion to reflect on this. And one thing I've heard from all quarters, whether it's Europe, the United States, Canada, parts of Latin America, is that China is incredibly active, although it's not so visible, at the municipal and provincial levels. So in Switzerland, at the canton level, as I understand it, there's a good deal of activity by the Chinese state and its surrogates, not always with the ambition of enriching local relationships or discussions, but often with the aim of manipulating. And I think this is something that can go under the radar where the national spotlight may not be shining brightly enough, or civil society groups that have developed expertise that focuses at the national level won't necessarily catch. So I think here too, this is part of the emerging challenge that we're starting to think about and recognizing understudied vulnerabilities to democratic integrity. I think one thing I would stress for the purposes of this discussion is that the democracies within the transatlantic community are in the process of and really have to strengthen their own thinking and understanding about how we defend democratic integrity. This was not something that was on the agenda, as I say, even as recently as a decade ago. That's changing, and that's a good thing, but we still have quite a way to go, both in the context of parliaments that have found themselves subject to such intrusions, but also other institutions that I've alluded to. The second point I would stress is that we often focus on individual tools or certain methods that are used by authoritarian powers that have become more assertive internationally. And this is terribly important. We have to understand these tools. But I think from a democracy point of view, we really need to keep our eye on the bigger picture and think about the effects of such influence and why it is that the authorities in China and Russia are pursuing this kind of engagement. What is it that they're seeking to do? What are the consequences of this engagement? And I think what I would say in shorthand is that some of the research we've done and some of the really terrific research and work that Péter Krekó and his colleagues have done, and others, looking at this kind of influence has really gravitated in the direction of challenging our assumptions about whether the resources and investments coming from China and Russia principally are aimed at enhancing those countries and those governments' image in a positive way, or winning hearts and minds. And as we've looked more carefully at this, I think what we've discovered is in many instances, not all of them, we've discovered that these sorts of engagements have some sort of aim toward censorship, whether it's in the academic setting, as we're seeing with China in so many places, whether it's in various political settings that manifest as political censorship, either by virtue of certain issues not finding their way onto the agenda or being twisted in ways that ultimately suit the interests and preferences of authoritarian political powers, rather than as part of a legitimate debate taking place in an open society. We've designated this sort of activity, the censorship outputs and the manipulation of independent institutions as sharp power. I think this is really worth considering in a larger context. And I think the other thing we all need to bear in mind, and this did come up in the discussion, but I fear in many places this isn't understood quite clearly enough. It may be changing now. It's that we're really talking about authoritarian governments like those in Russia and China that themselves brook absolutely no dissent at home. They're still committed to controlling institution and manipulating politics, and this is what they systematically do within their own borders. In an era of globalization where these sorts of governments and their surrogates have become much more active internationally, they're applying that sort of mentality and sensibility to the extent they're able to do so beyond their borders. And I think this is something where we're understanding better, but we have a way to go. I'll make one more reflection on that before I conclude. But the third point I wanted to raise is why it is that democratic standards and values matter so much today. I think in some part, this is staring us in the face, and it's related to my earlier points. The authoritarians today are exploiting open democratic systems in ways that might have been just about unimaginable only a few years ago, certainly before Russia's annexation of Crimea, which was a wake-up call. Even if we had a few wake-up calls before that that didn't quite get our attention, say the cyber attack on Estonia that happened several years before that, and the military conflict in Georgia. From a European perspective, the signs were emerging. Crimea's annexation, I think, got everyone to realize the extent of the challenge we're facing. And over time, we've come to realize that the ambitions to intrude and manipulate democratic institutions and democracies more broadly is a global challenge. And I think we need to now come to the conclusion that the authoritarians, while they may not be perfectly aligned, and we've talked both about the challenge presented by Russia and China in the European context, which I think is true, I think they're both a serious challenge. And I wouldn't necessarily privilege one over the other in terms of the threat they present to democratic institutions and integrity. We can quibble over that, but I think in the end, there's a sense of a shared consciousness that the authorities in Russia and China have reached as to what they feel is important. And this includes weakening democracies and their systems, to the extent possible, dividing them, whether it's within Europe, say in China's case in the 17+1 context, and in Russia's case for all to see, either intra-European divisions or divisions between North America and Europe. I think this is there for us to see quite visibly. It's up to us and the democracies to find effective ways to build solidarity in the face of the consciousness that the authoritarians have reached. I think one way to think of this is to think about what a shared democratic consciousness would look like in this new context. Let me just say a word about the good news. I think because we've now had a number of years since Crimea's annexation, using that as a point of reference to think about responses, to identify the problem, the challenges, and start responding. If we look at a country, and I'll just pick this country because I'm particularly familiar with it, like the Czech Republic, this is a country that punches, in my view, way above its weight in its response to the authoritarian challenge. So we have, for example, as we speak, officials from the Czech Republic in Taiwan speaking with, in my view, incredible candor and political courage. We have representatives like MEP Péter, who's taken a lead on issues relating to Tibet, and others of his colleagues. All of this, I think, needs to be recognized. And the point I would stress is the Czech Republic can't do this on its own. It's a country of 10 million. It's got a number of civil society groups that have focused like laser beams on the China challenge. It's got any number of groups that for many years have focused on the Russia challenge. And it's unreasonable for us to expect that a country of that size does these things on its own, but at the same time, it's sending a signal. And I think what we need to try to look at is the signals that are sent by Russia's engagement in other institutions. And I'll just pick this one, the OSCE's Office of Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, to hobble the work they do. As we speak, Tajikistan and Azerbaijan are working assiduously to try to prevent a rotation in the press freedom representative's office there, something that doesn't get much attention. But all of these things demand greater solidarity and attention from democracies. And the final observation I would make just in the larger context is that I don't think it's any surprise that we're in the midst of a very difficult challenge to democracy. That's something we're seeing without question in all the ways that have come up in this discussion and so many others. But I think now that we're understanding the challenges, one of the things that I would stress is we can't support democracy only when the going is good. And I think now that the going is tougher, it's all the more reason for us to think about creative and innovative ways to achieve greater solidarity, to think about creative solutions to these problems. And the good news is, in the recent past, there's so many new initiatives at the civil society level, courageous and thoughtful elected representatives like the one on this call and meeting, that I have a lot of hope that we're going to meet the challenge. And so with that, it was really a privilege and a pleasure to speak with you all. Thank you again, Peter. Thanks, Political Capital, for organizing this.
Thank you very much, Crystal, for the in-depth analysis and the very important global context that you brought in, but also for the encouraging words that bring some more hope into the discussion. I would like to give the floor to our MEP guests for a very final, very short comment, if you would like to. We have a few other questions that unfortunately we won't be able to raise. I will circulate it among the MEPs, and if one of them will be able to pick it up after the discussion, I'm happy. But right now, would you like to comment on what Chris said, or would you have some final concluding remarks? First, Michal?
Thank you, Peter. No, I would like to thank you first of all for organizing it and for a wonderful debate. And I think the paper that you produced is really good. And what it does is that it puts meat on the bones and gives us an idea of how authoritarian influences are, or how authoritarian politics can enter the European Union. I think we've spoken about Russia and China, which obviously are two main threats. I think, and this is my last sentence, and it's a bit provocative, when it comes to disruption of EU democracies and European unity, and it comes also to disruption of public discourse, I think there's one country which unfortunately has also played a role over the past 4 years, and that's the United States. And that's the campaign of Trump and his allies, Bannon and all these other guys, to weaken the European Union and divide it. And also, I have to say that in the COVID context, lots of the disinformation, also using now by Slovak extremists, are taken from the US alt-right. So this is just to say that when we think about, corrosion of our democracies and what threatens them, we shouldn't just be, looking. I mean, obviously, we should be looking through a geopolitical focus on Russia and China, but we should sort of be open-minded and see that it could come in unexpected ways. But that's all from me. Thanks so much again.
Thank you. I think it connects to the general, challenges to democracy in the overall Euro-Atlantic world that we perceive these days. Yes, unfortunately, undemocratic challenges not always comes only from outside. Anna?
Thank you so much. Thank you again for inviting me. I hope it was the first of a long series of discussion. I mean, not necessarily with us being invited, but with others as well, because such a topic deserves way much more than 1.5 hours. But it was a beautiful first 1.5 hours. Thank you so much. By myself, I learned a lot already, even though I'm working with these issues. What Michal said, yes, there's a really important point. The US issue is now it's getting in a completely different context than if it would be like 4 years or 5 years ago, which we have to involve them in the next round. But I think there is another thing if we're talking about the European level, that we kind of started to talk about it, but it deserves a deeper insight. Decision making in EU level, how it's influence on what we are thinking about foreign interface and foreign policy of the EU. I think, and what's the role of the European Parliament, and what are the chances and what are the differences between this Parliament or the previous, or what we have to do in order to safeguard this for the future. Before the other parliamentary session starts. I think this opens a lot of questions more and more and more. So I hope this is a beginning of a series of discussion on this issue. And thank you so much again for inviting me.
Thank you very much, me too. And we would like to organize more discussions on that. Some of them will retarget the Hungarian audience as well, because it's more an international panel. But and thanks a lot for your compliments on the study. Mikulás?
Yeah, I hope you can hear me. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for inviting me here, and also for organizing the event, because I think it is really important and necessary to have a clear and honest discussion about it. I think that there was a lot of said about authoritarian influences, and obviously there is no single denominator behind that, and we somehow need to tackle troubles from various sides. And then it's exactly the important part, not only to discuss just whether we are Europe or who is the bad, whether it's China or Russia, but rather more general principles like respect to democracy, respect to freedom of speech, respect to rule of law, respect to human rights, respect to human dignity. That's the things which will at the end of the day, or that's the only tools we have to stop those authoritarian influences and keep the world, let's say, nice place to live, rather than just like some Orwellian utopia. Thanks for the organization.
Thank you very much. And for last but not least, Viola.
Yeah, very quickly, thanks. I couldn't agree more with what my colleagues have said before, especially Michal, also to the corrosive democracy now in the US and the unfortunately malign influence into our right-wing arms of different parties. But nevertheless, I really like this expression of strategic corruption, which Christopher has mentioned, and that brings us back to a lot of homework which we have to do in terms of anti-money laundering and other things, where we see when we talk to people in Ukraine, Russia, Azerbaijan, and so on and so forth, and they say, well, indeed, you give a lot of access to our oligarchs, to our decision makers, to our rich businessmen, so they get access either via passports or via real estate and investment in our European Union. And this is also, I think, a big issue which we have to solve when we start talk about empowering the European Union and developing some kind of instruments how to defend our democratic values. That would be my last words. And thanks a lot for everything, for the study, for the work, for the, as Anna has mentioned, the start of a longer debate. Since we are both in this committee on interference, foreign interference, I think we can easily continue on this issue a little bit later. Thank you.
Yes, so please do, and please, yeah, push for the important principles that we have just discussed. So I would like to thank for all of you. Thanks, Viola. Thanks, Anna, Christopher, Michal, Mikuláš for being here. I already had quite a lot of comments, emails, messenger messages that it was a very good discussion, and I think these comments were honest. So thanks a lot for being here, and thanks also for our partners for partnering us. Thanks for National Endowment for Democracy for supporting the project, and also thanks for my colleagues for helping the organization. And I haven't named one of them, Katalin Szitas, who have to put together this all. She's behind all of our successful events. So thanks a lot for all of you, and thanks for the audience. And you can already access this study, which is on our website, and which is accessible also from our Twitter. So feel free to read it, and also any comments are welcome. Thank you. Bye.